Welcome to UONGOZI. I'm Baby Kabai. I'm joined by Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for the Study of African Economies at Oxford University. Professor Collier has published cutting-edge research on a broad range of issues pertinent to economic development. In particular, he has researched extensively on natural resource booms and their impact on the economies. He has advised numerous governments and international organizations on this issue. And on the professor's right, we're also joined by Ambassador Mpungwe, former chairman of the Tanzania Chamber of Minerals. Ambassador Mpungwe was Tanzania's first High Commissioner to South Africa in 1994 and was instrumental in attracting a large volume of foreign direct investment from South Africa into Tanzania and continues to be highly sought after as an advisor to government and the private sector on investment policy. On the show, we are discussing managing natural resources. Thank you, gentlemen, Ambassador and Professor, for accepting our invitation. Karibu, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, there's a general feeling, especially among the common population, that Africa is rich in natural resources. Is this perception correct, or could it possibly be that this is being exaggerated given the actual quantities available in the continent? Professor, I'll start with you.
No, it's right. This is your big opportunity. Africa's very short of other assets, but it's got a lot of natural assets. And so harnessing those assets for prosperity, that's the opportunity, and that's the challenge that this generation has.
Ambassador Mpungwe, you are the former chairperson of the Tanzania Chamber of Minerals and Energy. In your view, what is the role of foreign investment in the development of the natural resource sector?
When you talk about mineral resources or oil and gas, it requires investment, and precisely because the type of investments that is required or are required are massive, the internal capacity is very much limited, and therefore we don't have much option except to try and mobilize foreign investments. But the trick here is how do you manage that attraction process, and this is the challenge to the leadership of the continent.
Still on you, Ambassador Mpungwe, from an investor's perspective, what are some of the major challenges facing this sector if I was to narrow it down to Tanzania?
Yeah, certainly for an investor, the areas would be about 3, 4. One is the policy environment. Is the policy environment conducive and attractive enough to make an investment decision? The fiscal regime, the taxation regime, that also influences the investment decision. The legal framework, the regulatory framework, administrative procedures, issues of law and order in terms of protection. Those are the issues that rank quite high among various investors in making their final investment decisions. And thank God, in Tanzania, you wanted me to specifically comment on Tanzania. We'd sorted out most of these problems way back. We had a long period of a lull since independence, but in mid-1990s when we started economic reforms, and specifically around 1997 when the new mining policy was put in place and the new Mining Act was put in place. All these issues were considered in terms of making Tanzania competitive enough to attract FDI. And we did manage to get a lot of investors from late 1990s. And surprisingly, in about, Paul, in about 5 short years, Tanzania moved from almost zero export of gold to number 3 in Africa. We displaced Mali at that time, which was number 3. And since then, there've been some changes in the environment, and I think the Malians didn't want to lose their position. We lost the number 3 spot, and Mali has taken back its position. We're now number 4.
Back to Professor Collier. You have been quoted saying that, to quote, to better harness the full potential of its natural resource potential, African countries must strengthen their governance systems, especially putting in place adequate checks and balances.
The default option with natural resources is plunder. other people benefit rather than the mass of citizens. Right? And that happens unless you get good regulation. Right? You need a good tax system in order to capture the value of natural resources from the companies that take the stuff out of the ground, leaving them with enough for a decent profit, but all the surplus, that's what needs to accrue to the society through a tax system.
Okay.
And then the government had to spend that money well, in such a way that benefits not just the present but the future, because there are two sorts of plunder with natural resources: the few expropriating what should benefit the many, and the present generation burning up what should benefit future generations.
So we deplete our own resources.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so as you run down natural assets, which is an appropriate thing to do, but as you run down those natural assets, you better build up some other assets. Take valuable natural resources from under the ground and build more productive assets on top of the ground. That's the process you're trying to go through.
And is this the process where most of the African countries are failing in? Just that little equation right there?
It is that right there. They take the stuff out of the ground, but there's nothing to show for it at the end of it.
And governments in Africa are often perceived as not being adequately in control when it comes to the management of natural resources, just what we're talking about. What kind of government control involvement is needed, aside from just a taxing system? And how much can be considered to be adequate in this sector? Okay? Do you think we can actually achieve this as African governments?
Of course you can. Look at Botswana, it's done it, right? There's nothing un-African about harnessing natural resources for prosperity. It's proved difficult all over the world. You've got some successes and some failures all over the world, right? There's nothing African about messing natural resources up, right? So let's look at the chain of things that just has to go right.
Okay.
And the first thing is you've got to manage that discovery process right. As the ambassador was saying, you attract companies in, but not with so many benefits that they run off with the benefits, right? So trying to get a transparent, competitive process. And a good start is for the government itself to get some geological information so that the government itself has some idea as to what it's got. If you really don't know what you've got, then it's harder to get good value out of the companies. Right? So get some public geological information first. That's now pretty easy from aerial surveys. So use the new technology, get the public geological information. Then make sure you've got a good tax system, and the principle of taxing natural resources is tax what you can observe, and correspondingly, whatever it is you're taxing, make sure you observe it. So observe what you tax. If you don't do that, then it's very easy for the natural resource companies, and I'm sure the ones that the ambassador was involved in haven't done this, but it's very easy for natural resource companies to, to slide money out of the country in such a way that it escapes the tax net.
For Tanzania, it's a new industry in its current form. As I said, it started about 15 years ago or less. So there's need to build that capacity of understanding the industry in its various characteristics. So I think that's a big challenge to have the government and the workforce which is highly skilled and informed about the sector. And in that way, not only that it's an additional incentive to the investors, because most investors would also find it much more efficient to have local skills.
Local skills and workforce, that's true.
But also enable the government to be able to be on top of the situation. So it works both ways, and positively to the government and to the investors. But it's still a challenge.
It's still a challenge.
I think the government still has to invest a lot in itself in building the requisite skills, in understanding the nature and character of the industry, and in driving the various processes that the professor said, in terms of discovery process and taxation regime, and other, add-on activities in the mining, including the linkages with the rest of the economy, the value-add activities, processing, and all these things. So it needs a nation that is well geared and well prepared to be on top of the industry that is struggling.
Just to cap on that, in your roundtable discussion just here in Tanzania, you mentioned a critical mass of informed citizens, okay? Critical mass of informed citizens. Before I ask you to expound on that, just wanted to recap on what Ambassador Mpungwe says. Is there a need then for education or knowledge or training for these citizens to know how much or what they've got below ground to be like Ambassador Mpungwe says that we don't really have the know-how just yet. So is it a prerequisite to have this educational knowledge from the grassroots level to come up, so at least we're all aware of what it is and we can be our masters and be skilled in our own profit that we're getting from below ground?
I think there's two different sorts of capacities. One is the technical capacities within the civil service.
Yes.
And you need to train up a cadre of civil servants who are skilled in how to tax, another group who are skilled in the geology, and so on and so forth. So there's a technical expertise within the civil service. Then there's a different issue, which is a critical mass of ordinary citizens who understand up from down on these issues, what it means to harness these resources for sustained prosperity, that the discovery process should be transparent, that the tax system should be effective, but not so effective that you don't get any companies. You can only skin the cat once, you know?
True.
So if you get a tax system which tries to skin it twice, there's not enough cats, you know?
Information sharing, still on the same kind of topic, between investors and government, and between government and its people, is an important aspect in the management of natural resources, what we're just discussing right now. So how can resource-rich African countries improve this important management factor? Ambassador Mpungwe.
Yeah, as Paul was saying, I think it's important for to have a citizenry which is well informed, and here it's a leadership challenge as well. You need a leadership that appreciate the dynamics of this investment process and make the citizens get the right information, because it's a complex industry. It's something which is underground, nobody knows, and different people can make different valuations about what is there and what is coming out, goes to the government. And it is in this regard, coming back to Tanzania, for us in the Chamber of Mines, that's why we've been very active participants in the extractive industry transparency. Yeah, because it does, the more the citizens are told the truth about what is happening, it also makes our lives much better.
Sure.
Yes, because I can tell you, it's quite frustrating. Every time you walk around in town, a finger is pointed to you.
Of course.
People have to appreciate what is being talked about, and precisely because it's a very complex industry, it's also on the investor side. We also feel that the public understanding of the industry is very low. People think it's easy to invest on Monday and declare dividends on Tuesday. The risks that are involved through the processes of exploration up to the time we come to actual production. So we're also in a very uncomfortable situation when we don't see that necessary body of knowledge existing in dealing with mining issues.
But I think it's intrinsically it's entirely possible to get ordinary citizens up to speed on these issues. And families are not fools. Families all have to balance decisions about the future, because all families have got children, and so they're concerned about the future. And so, in principle, people can well understand that if you're depleting a natural asset that's going to run out, there's only so much gold in Tanzania. If you spend it all on consumption, your children won't have anything.
For the case of Tanzania, Ambassador Mpungwe,
Yes.
would you say there has been enough of information sharing and open dialogue to discuss pertinent issues between investors, the government, and the general public?
Not as much as I would have wanted. I think the problems that come out of lack of
Information sharing.
information sharing is the cause of all these uncertainties and misunderstanding about the industry, and even resistance, which could be justifiable because the people don't understand what's happening, and therefore it's very important that information sharing should exist, and I think and should exist in a manner that is not just a matter of ticking the box because a certain donor country insists on stakeholder dialogue. It has to come out of genuine commitment that out of such information sharing, everybody is made aware and everybody benefits from exchange and can debate on the issues and come into consensus. And it's important. And from both sides. From the investor's perspective, you don't want to invest in an environment which is hostile or you're misunderstood. And for the government, you don't have to be a minister or a president leading an industry that people are complaining against.
And pointing fingers.
And pointing fingers.
Ordinary people are actually hungry to know what's going on,
Yeah.
especially young people.
Yes.
Why young people? Partly they're used to handling information, and partly it's their future.
Oh, yes.
If the resources are burnt up and not used for the future, it's the young people who'll pay the price.
Definitely they will suffer.
I was just very recently speaking on these issues in Uganda. They've just discovered oil. You've got gas, they've got oil. And so their young people want to know, how's this oil going to be used? Is it going to be used to benefit the future? So I turned up to speak at the central bank. We got an audience of 2,500 people, nearly all young. So there's a burning sense of is this going to be a repeat of the history of plunder, or is this time going to be different? And if it's going to be different, how do we know it's going to be different? What's changed?
And Paul is making a very important issue that African leaders should appreciate. There is a demographic shift. In Tanzania here, 72% of the population is people under 29. And these are the majority of Tanzania. And these are the voters. So this demographic shift also puts another dimension that requires all those who are involved in the mining industry to keep the population informed.
Very true.
The politicians is in their best interest because these are the voters. For us in the mining, these are the employees, the customers, the service providers, and the owners of the resource.
Back to Professor Collier. There are views that most of the benefits in the natural resource sector are accrued indirectly through linkages with the rest of the economy. For example, supply contracts for the purchases of goods and services rather than taxation. What is your suggestion how best to enhance the contribution of this sector to economic development?
Okay, first, I don't think what you said is strictly right, that I think the big benefits are how the government spends the money with taxation. That's where the big money is.
Okay.
That's where the big money is. And take Botswana. There's not much you do with diamonds. You take them out of the grounds and you sell them. But Botswana's still developed, So just getting the literal physical linkages from the natural resource you get out of the ground to what you do with it next, sometimes that makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. What matters really is that you create a business environment in which that all those revenues finance a lot of other activities. They pay for decent infrastructure, for good electricity, for good ports, and then a lot of other activities become viable. So don't get fixated about the add-on activities just in the neighborhood of the natural resources. Sometimes they make sense, but they're a small part of the story of the journey to prosperity. A lot of mining doesn't really employ very many people. I was talking with the director of strategy for one of the biggest mining companies in the world. And he wanted to talk to me because he was a worried man. And his worry was that the new generation of resource extraction technology basically won't employ anybody at all.
It will just be machine.
It's all machine.
All machine.
And so he was saying, where's going to be our constituency of support in a country where we take the stuff out and there are no jobs, you know? And so the constituency of support really has to come not from the industry itself, but from what the government does with the money.
That's very true. And in how would you answer that question, Ambassador Mpungwe, in your view?
No, I will agree with Paul. I'll fully agree with Paul because, and that's the only way to save for the future. If you can spend in a manner that you build your asset stock as a country, and this is the saving for the future, because even if you run out of that particular resource, the future generation will continue to benefit from what you've invested in.
If all your jobs are in the mine sector and the mine closes, you've not only lost the revenues, you've lost the jobs. If instead you've used the money to build jobs in a different sector, you know, that sector continues.
Paul, I just came back from Twara, and this is where the Center of Oil and Gas Exploration is taking place. It's mind-boggling because the numbers that you hear, they're quite big. You know, they're big finds there. And what worries me that as a people and as a country, are we really prepared to handle this kind of huge resources? And we hear a lot of investment money coming in, billions of dollars, which makes us far ahead of everyone in the neighborhood here. I think this is where the government has to provide strategic leadership in a number of areas in terms of understanding, as Paul has been saying, understanding the character of the industry itself, the gas industry. Yes. Yeah, the government has to be on top and make the people understand the character and nature of that industry. And I think if I was in government today, I wouldn't form a commission or anything. I would just pick some 400 brilliant Tanzanians and send them to the best schools, oil and gas, and in 4 years' time, I think, to be back and handle that. But also the government should also be thinking about some strategic interventions that would make the government and the country an equal participant in the exploitation of this resource. The gas industry will need huge infrastructure, the ports, and then considering issues like LNG production, and the government should be ahead of the game. So, I mean, what I've heard and seen in Mtwara, I would even suggest to have a Ministry of Mtwara Development Node to focus on that.
And what should governments of resource-rich, low-income countries do with the revenues accrued from natural resources as a region of what you're talking about? What can we do with this?
Right. So the key thing is a lot of those revenues need to be invested in the country.
Right.
Now, that's easier said than done. Right? You only have to look at elsewhere to see it's quite possible to spend a lot on investment and not get very much for it. Right? So building the capacity to invest well. I call that investing in investing.
Investing in investing.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that within the public sector, that is a bit technocratic. It means actually getting the people trained up so that they can evaluate projects in advance and implement them well. It's hard to believe, but not every project dreamed up by a politician is a good idea.
Okay.
Right? It might sound a good idea to the politician, but it's not always is a good idea. Yeah. Sometimes it's a very expensive white elephant, you know? And so you need a disciplined process which can say, yes, Minister, but, you know, here are the numbers.
Yes.
And building that technocratic process and building the political support for saying, we're going to listen to the technocrats. we're not going to let the minister decide on a Sunday afternoon that he wants a road here or a railway there or a, whatever. And so getting some discipline into these investment decisions and then getting good implementation so it's competitive, not ridden with cronyism and corruption. So good project selection, good project implementation, that's hard. It will take you some years to build that capacity. You've not got it yet. But you need that in order to harness your natural assets for a prosperous future. Otherwise, even if you save and invest, you'll just get, stadiums and things like that, grandiose things
that don't actually mean anything at the end of the day. Ambassador Mpungwe, let's narrow that to Tanzania at what Professor Collier just explained in terms of how we can actually harness and how we can use, the profits that come from the natural resources. Are we doing that here in Tanzania?
Possibly. Let me give the government some benefit of that in the sense the industry is young. We've only been active in the last 10, 12 years. But certainly the message is clear, and we've seen in some countries where they've been misallocating and misusing the resources. And I think that message is reaching Tanzania. The debates about the mining industry have been quite intensive. And I should believe that our leadership is taking note of that and translating that into policies and strategies that direct proper use of the revenues and incomes coming from mining industry and directing them to the proper investments. And one way, from investor perspective, I think, is to create an environment that you make your investors have a long-term view about the country and a long-term commitment. Paul in the morning mentioned about the Botswana, the diamond company, which is a partnership between the government of Botswana and De Beers.
De Beers, yes. 40 years you mentioned.
Yeah,
40-year partnership. That's a long-term
commitment,
it is, yes.
Yeah, and which we should create those kind of relationship and be partners in being long-term in our thinking and planning and investment strategies.
Ambassador Mpungwe, we have often heard about conflicts with local communities in some of the investment sites in Tanzania. What has been your experiencing in managing local community demands and rights?
I have a friend in Johannesburg who said, they translated their gold from the ground and built Johannesburg, which has replaced the gold
on the ground and has still made a very big major city.
And Johannesburg now major city, and they've
Definitely
created a new industry altogether, a new economic activity. But going back to the relationship between mining companies and the communities, surrounding communities, that's a huge problem. It frustrates me because it's a problem that shouldn't be there. I think it is in the best interest of the mining companies themselves to have a good relationship with the communities. And indeed, from my position as a former chairman of the Chamber of Mines, I know most of our membership, all our membership, are striving to have a good relationship with the neighboring communities. And they're investing a lot in terms of both social and economic infrastructure. Social meaning, hospitals, schools, water projects, and all these things. And also in building some other activities, opening up opportunities for other economic activities like agriculture, tourism, commerce around there. But then this is only half of the story. The other half of the story is the general expectation of the country and the communities that the mining industry should be doing more than that. And this is where your previous question on communication between mining,
government and the people. Right.
Yeah, and this is where I think has become source of the problem. That kind of communication doesn't exist. And when it exists, you find issues are being commercial issues are being politicized, and that's where there's a challenge that we have, and that's a challenge that we have to resolve. The three partners: the government, the community, and the mining companies. Yeah. We have a problem there.
Now, when we talk about communities, especially where you have to, sometimes in some cases, especially in Tanzania, some communities have been moved from the areas because people are mining in the areas that they previously lived and they're relocated to somewhere else. One question is, how do we manage that to actually assist the communities that are being relocated and moved, one? And secondly, what happens with our, for lack of a better word, what happens to the holes that you've got left? What happens with that land? Your friend in Johannesburg says, well, they got the gold out of the ground and they made a metropolitan city.
Yes.
What are we doing once we remove our gold and our tanzanite from the ground, or our gas and our oil? What happens to the ground after that?
That ground partly, the environmental part of it is integral part of the mining activity. Is well in today's corporate world, we speak of a triple bottom line for sustainable development. You look at the profit, but also you look at the environmental conservation, exactly. And also the social responsibility. So that's part of inherent part of our activity. But more importantly, and this has been at the core of our discussion today, it's not just you can have that all, but depending on how you use the resource in saving for the future, in building the asset base, or develop other assets which can sustain the economic activity and grow, then you can deal with it all. But if you have a situation where you have a hole and no impact,
nothing to show,
there's been a major, it becomes a huge problem. And that,
so nothing normally happens to the holes,
no,
regardless of how the money is being spent?
No. The holes, what I'm saying here, the closure of mine processes and procedures. You don't just leave a hole and go away. There's some environmental issues that we have to take care in reclaiming the place and leaving it in a much more presentable situation than just a bare hole. But the bigger issue is, even if you've covered it nicely and you put vegetation, but what has that community, what has the country benefited? And I think this has been the core of our discussion.
Oh, right.
And that's true.
Yeah.
If citizens around the country haven't benefited from the resource extraction, either in the present or in the future, then no matter what the company does around that hole, it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
The big story has to be, yes, there's some temporary environmental damage, which we're going to keep to a minimum, and we're going to compensate the local community, fully compensate the local community for that, but there's a big prize which is generated, which you can all see. Now, which you can all see is a vital part of that story.
Yes, and it's one line that we don't normally get to hear.
And this is why the Niger Delta
Right.
has been such a disaster.
Right.
That what people in the Niger Delta can see is that there hasn't been these shared benefits. And so what they see is plunder, and that creates, moves from the legitimate demand of saying we want full and generous compensation for any environmental damage to the illegitimate demand, which says it's our oil.
Right.
Now, you don't want local communities running off and saying it's our gold, it's our this, it's our that. It's the natural resources have got to benefit all citizens, present and future. And so to forestall those illegitimate claims, it's mine, I'm the lucky guy sitting on top of the gold mine, to forestall those illegitimate claims, you've got to deal with the legitimate. You've got to deal with that thoroughly, generously, confidently, so that people can trust it.
And that is from the miners, not the government. Has this got anything to do with government?
I think it's both.
It's both.
Okay.
The government has to provide leadership. You don't want. Sometimes you're economists, Paul. I don't know, but sometimes our African governments take this that free market economy, too much to the letter that believe that the government just remain passive and falls. No, I think government has a role to provide the strategic leadership.
That is very true.
Let me give you an example of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, BP oil spill. Now, that it's a free market economy and all that, but it's an environment in which there's a very rigorous legal framework which says if you create any environmental damage, you pay for it. And so BP has been desperate to compensate everybody completely for any environmental damage, more than fully compensate. Right? And you contrast that with the Niger Delta, different legal framework, no imperative, you know, and so the government has an irreducible role of providing the legal environment, the credible legal environment in which environmental damage has to be, people can rely on the fact that if there is damage, it's going to be paid for. And that creates the incentive for companies to keep the damage to a minimum.
That's true. Ambassador Mpungwe, just to get a note on what Professor Collier says, there have been situations like that in Tanzania. I don't know if it's a fact or myth, but there have been situations where local communities have blamed big mining companies of, you know, spilling, poisoning the rivers, poisoning the water. And has the government come to their rescue in this case, or has it just been, again, a sensational story?
No, well, now in my position as chairman of the chamber, all that the reports we got from our membership, the reports were being disputed from our membership. So,
but is that a business setback, or is it the reality of the story? Because it could be business. We didn't do anything.
As a chairman, I had to believe my members.
Okay.
I had to believe my members, and I think. I mean, in our mining activities, the questions of safety and health are quite central, we strive to put in place some best practices. There may be a case here and there of lapse in focus, but certainly the commitment to apply best practices in our health and safety issues is quite central to us.
And do you normally compensate in issues where something has come up like this?
And this is where now Paul says, if someone has messed up, he has to compensate, and that's the government has to come up.
The government and, of course, also the Chamber of Mines. And also
the Chamber of Mines, of course, we would also sanction a member who is misbehaving.
Right.
Giving a bad name to all of us.
That's very true.
Yes.
That's very true. As we come to the end of this interview, is there a code or a formula that can be you can actually say it's a one-size-fits-all for African countries?
I think there's one code which I really would recommend. Okay. Yeah, and that is something called the Natural Resource Charter, which you can all just go online with Google and there's the Natural Resource Charter. This is a set of principles and guidelines for the whole decision chain. It's been adopted by NEPAD, economic arm of the African Union, as a flagship program. Right? It's strongly endorsed by the African Development Bank, and so now the challenge is for those African governments which are presiding over natural resource riches to actually adopt those guidelines, those principles. What NEPAD will do with the government is help it build capacities all along that decision chain. We've talked earlier about the need for trained Tanzanians, and building the pertinent capacities along that decision chain in Tanzania, that's the task. So there's a code that's actually useful, I think, yeah.
I think the current state of underdevelopment is completely unacceptable, and we should do something as a continent and as individual countries to make this continent shouldn't be poor. It's too rich to be poor. And coming to Tanzania, I think this country is filthy rich in every aspect of resource, not only mining. You know, agricultural potential is huge. When you talk about tourism, you know, we can easily say we want to be #1 tourism country in the world and become, because we have everything that it takes. Coming to minerals and oil and gas, you know, already the discoveries are proving that point, that we are a very rich country. Then we should find a way of becoming prosperous, and I think the solution the professor here has outlined what needs to be done in terms of discovery process, the taxation regime, you know, the building capital base investment for the future, and so on and so forth. I think those are the issues that should characterize our strategic conversation as we plan for the future. And I think we should do now. The time is running out. Yeah.
Definitely, it has to be now. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you about managing natural resources. I'm enlightened by today's information. It has been a very good, enlightening, mind-opener, and I'm sure for the viewer as well, they've learned more. In case they thought it was a simple matter, it's a little bit more complex than that. Well, we have been talking to Professor Paul Collier, the Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for the Study of African Economies at Oxford University, and also we've been talking to Ambassador Mpungwe, who's the immediate former chairman of the Tanzania Chambers of Minerals. Ambassador Mpungwe was also Tanzania's first High Commissioner to South Africa in 1994 and was instrumental in attracting a large volume of foreign direct investment from South Africa into Tanzania. You've been with me, Baby Kabai. Thank you very much for joining us on UONGOZI.